Now, most people were taught that World War I was decided entirely on the battlefields of Europe. As they were taught that the destiny of nations was shaped by artillery barrages, trench warfare, and brave infantry charges across the muddy fields of Flanders and Somme. And when standard history textbooks mention the Middle East, they treated the region as a secondary theater, as a sideshow to the great clash of industrial empires in Europe. Those same textbooks, when students are introduced to the Balfour Declaration, is presented as a moment of noble diplomacy. A moral promise, as by a compassionate British Empire, in the heat of World War I, to facilitate a national home for the Jewish people. They are told that Arthur Balfour, as British Foreign Secretary, was moved by idealistic motives or Christian Zionist sympathies. They are told that London acted out of wartime generosity or a desire to right historical wrongs. That is the version of history taught in high school classrooms across North America and Europe. That is the version recorded in encyclopedia summaries and popular historical documentaries. It is a clean narrative, a story of moral conviction, diplomatic leadership, and strategic foresight. But if you turn away from the romanticized speeches delivered in Parliament and open the private, archived ledgers of the British Treasury, a very different story begins to emerge. A story that was never meant for public consumption. The 1916s, the British Empire, wealthiest and most powerful imperial force on the planet, was facing an invisible crisis. A crisis that no amount of soldiers, ships, or artillery shells could solve. It was not running out of courage, or military willpower. It was running out of gold. London was spending $10 million every single day in New York City to purchase food, oil, steel, and ammunition for itself and its European allies. The Bank of England, the financial beating heart of global trade, was draining its physical gold bullion reserves at a catastrophic rate. Across the Atlantic, the private Wall Street banking syndicates, led by the legendary House of J. Morgan, were reaching their absolute legal limits for private loans to foreign governments. The British Empire was standing on the precipice of total financial insolvency. Without a massive, unprecedented infusion of credit from the United States, the entire Allied war machine would collapse on its feet for the end of 1926. And so, inside the dimly lit rooms of 10 Downing Street, and the private executive offices of Wall Street banks, a cold, calculated geopolitical transaction was set into motion. Britain did not just need military victory on the Western Front. It desperately needed a financial lifeline from Washington to satisfy its American creditors and secure the vital maritime arteries of its global empire. And to pay for that financial lifeline, London placed a property on the international negotiating table that belonged to it. Put Palestine on the ledger. This is not a story about religious prophecy or moral benevolence. This is the hidden financial history of the Balfour Declaration. And the story of how war debt, private credit lines, backing syndicates, imperial desperation, redrew the map of the Middle East for over a century. On November 2nd, 1917, Arthur James Balfour signed a short official letter, addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild. The entire text contained exactly 67 words. It was not a formal treaty, created and ratified by the British Parliament. It was not a public statute, voted on by the citizens of Great Britain. It was a piece of private correspondence, sent from one powerful aristocrat, to another. On the surface, the words appeared simple, almost poetic in their phrasing. The document stated that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It included a carefully worded proviso, stating that nothing should be done, which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. For over a century, Orthodox historians have framed this 67-word statement as a triumphant milestone of Zionist diplomacy, or as a gesture of humanitarian goodwill extended by a sympathetic superpower. But empires locked in a struggle for total survival do not issue binding geopolitical commitments out of goodwill. November 1917 had been trapped in a grinding stalemate with Imperial Germany for 3 agonizing years. Over 800,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers had already perished in the mud of the Western Front. The British government was spending over £7 million every 24 hours to keep its military operational. Nation was drained dry, both in human lives, liquid financial capital. The ruthless calculus of imperial statecraft, every official signature serves a strategic purpose. So why did the British War Cabinet, chaired by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, spend months debating every single comma and preposition of a 67-word letter about a small, arid province of the Ottoman Empire, 5,000 miles away? Why was the recipient of this historic letter Lord Walter Rothschild, a senior figure in the world's most prominent private banking dynasty? And why did this declaration appear at the exact historical moment as when Britain's war debt to American banks was threatening to destroy the value of the British Bank An? To understand why those 67 words altered the history of the Middle East forever, must look past the public statements of politicians. Must follow the paper trail of money across the Atlantic Ocean to the private vaults of Wall Street. When World War I erupted in August 1940, the city of London was the undisputed capital of global finance. British Bank Sterling, strictly backed by the gold standard, functioned as the supreme reserve currency for world trade. If a merchant in South America wanted to trade with Asia, or a European government needed to raise capital, did so through London banks. The Bank of England sat at the center of this financial spiderweb, guaranteeing global liquidity and monetary stability. When war was declared against Germany and Austria-Hungary, the British government took on a massive, unprecedented financial burden. London agreed to act as the primary financial guarantor for the entire Allied alliance. That meant Great Britain was not only funding its own Royal Navy, its own growing expeditionary army. It was also bankrolling the war efforts of Imperial Russia, France, Italy, Serbia, Belgium. If the Russian Imperial Army needed rifles and artillery, shells, the British Treasury underwrote the contracts. If France needed coal, the steel and industrial machinery, each credit guaranteed the purchases. If Italy required grain to prevent mass starvation among its civilian population, its capital made those imports possible. In the early months of the conflict, European military strategists believed the war would be brief. They assumed the fighting would be over by Christmas 1914, settled by swift military maneuvers and decisive battlefield victories. Instead, the war devolved into a prolonged industrial war of attrition. The conflict consumed raw steel, some high explosives, cotton, petroleum, and food at a rate that European manufacturing facilities could not sustain. European factories were short of raw materials, and millions of skilled workers had been mobilized into military units. There was only one nation on earth that had possessed the vast agricultural expanse and industrial capacity to keep the Allied armies supplied. United States of America. As to purchase these essential war materials from American corporations, as the British government could not pay in paper currency. American manufacturers, steel mills, and agricultural exporters did not accept British bank sterling, or French francs. As they demanded payment in physical gold bullion or in liquid United States dollars, deposited directly into American banks. As during the first 18 months of the war, Britain paid for these massive orders by shipping physical gold across the Atlantic. The Royal Navy battleships were converted into armored floating vaults, tons of gold bars from London to Halifax, Canada, and then on to New York. As trainloads of gold bars were moved under armed guard to settle British government accounts with American suppliers. As by mid-1950, the relentless drain of gold from the Bank of England was creating severe alarm among top financial officials. As in Lord Cunliffe, the governor of the Bank of England, he warned the Treasury that the gold reserves were falling to dangerously low levels. As if the Bank of England's gold backing dropped below a critical threshold, their national confidence in the bank sterling would collapse. As such a collapse would trigger a global run on British currency, thus destroying London's position as the financial center of the world and rendering Britain unable to buy further war supplies. Thus, the British Empire was consuming its financial seed corn. Thus, it desperately needed an alternative mechanism to fund its purchases in the United States. The powerful financial agent in New York, capable of securing private credit, organizing banking syndicates, and selling British government war bonds to American investors. Early 1915, British Treasury found that agent in the most formidable private banking institution in human history. The House of J.P. Morgan and Company. January 1915, British government signed a confidential commercial agreement with J. Morgan and Company, located at 23 Wall Street. Thus, under the terms of this extraordinary contract, J.P. Morgan was appointed as the commercial agency for the British and French governments in the United States. Thus, this meant that every single purchase of war material made by Britain and France in America had to be negotiated, processed, and approved through J.P. Morgan. Thus, if the British War Office needed 100 million rifle cartridges or 2 million tons of steel, J.P. Morgan placed the orders with American manufacturers. If the French military needed aviation fuel or grain, J.P. Morgan handled the transactions. At the peak of the purchasing program, J.P. Morgan was buying over $20 million worth of goods every single day, half of Allied governments. Jack Morgan, the son of the legendary founder J. Pierpont Morgan, effectively became the purchasing director for half the world's military power. To fund these colossal purchases, J.P. Morgan organized massive banking syndicates across the United States. They issued hundreds of millions of dollars in short-term Allied war bonds, selling them to commercial banks, insurance companies, and wealthy private investors. For a time, this private credit machine operated with incredible efficiency. American industrial magnates and farmers generated record-breaking profits. European armies received an endless stream of artillery shells and oil. And J.P. Morgan collected immense banking commissions on every contract that passed through its offices. However, by late 1916, this private credit machine began to hit a dead end. Then, American investors were growing increasingly nervous about the sheer volume of European war debt accumulating in American banks. Rumors were circulating on Wall Street that the Allied powers might not win the war, or that the military stalemate would force an inconclusive peace. If the Allies lost, or agreed to a peace without victory, how would they ever repay billions of dollars in war loans? As the total financial liability owed by Britain and France to private American lenders had reached staggering proportions. November 1916, United States Federal Reserve Board issued a public warning to American commercial banks. As the Federal Reserve advised banks that it was unsafe to continue accumulating short-term treasury bills from foreign governments engaged in war. As the message from Washington was clear. American financial stability was being dangerously tied to the survival of the British Empire. Now, when the Federal Reserve issued that warning, the tap of private American credit shut off almost instantly. American banks refused to buy any more British war bonds, or extend new lines of credit to the British Treasury. The timing for London could not have been more catastrophic. By December 1966, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Reginald McKenna, submitted a confidential memo to the British War Cabinet. The document contained a chilling financial diagnosis. McKenna informed the cabinet that Britain's liquid dollar reserves in New York were days away from total exhaustion. Britain was spending over $200 million a month in the United States, but could no longer borrow a single dollar from private American institutions. McKenna wrote in clear terms, "We are rapidly approaching a position in which we will no longer be able to pay for our purchases in the United States." Implications were catastrophic. If Britain defaulted on its payments to American manufacturers, the factory assembly lines in Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Chicago would come to a halt. Cargo ships loaded with munitions and fuel oil would remain docked in New York Harbor. Thus, the British Royal Navy would be forced to ration oil for its battleships, and Allied artillery batteries on the Western Front would run out of ammunition within weeks. The empire was facing total military defeat. It was not because of German troop movements, but because of a liquidity crisis on Wall Street. There was only one way to save Great Britain from financial collapse. The United States government itself had to enter the war and transform private Wall Street loans into public American Treasury debt. By early 1917, the financial machinery of the British Empire was operating on borrowed time. Every morning, when the financial markets opened in New York, British Treasury officials monitored the exchange rate of the British pound to sterling against the United States dollar. If the pound dropped below $4.67, a wave of automated sell orders would be triggered across global money markets. To prevent this catastrophic currency devaluation, the Bank of England had to spend millions of dollars every week buying its own currency on the open market. It was a bleeding wound that could not be bandaged with traditional diplomatic statements. Inside the British War Cabinet, chaired by the newly appointed Prime Minister David Lloyd George, ministers met in an atmosphere of quiet desperation. The military situation on the Western Front was deteriorating. The French army was suffering from widespread mutinies following the disastrous Nivelle offensive. The Russian Empire was crumbling from within, as food riots erupted on the streets of Petrograd, threatening to collapse the Eastern Front. And in the Atlantic Ocean, Imperial Germany had just resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping every month. Germany's military commanders had calculated that by sinking supply ships heading for Great Britain, they could starve the British population and starve the British military of resources before the United States could ever mobilize an army. But the German commanders were missing a critical piece of financial intelligence. Great Britain was going to run out of food or gunpowder first. Great Britain was going to run out of American credit. January 1917, Cecil Spring Rice, Dutch ambassador to Washington, as a urgent encrypted telegram to the Foreign Office in London. As the ambassador reported that the private banking houses of Wall Street, in JP Morgan, as had reached their absolute legal limits for extending loans to foreign nations. Under American banking regulations, as commercial banks